net neutrality, and we've heard something about that already this morning from the very first presentation. And we propose to give it a treatment this afternoon that is a good overview. And if I read the title of the planned presentation, it's trying to be a fair, balanced, nuanced assessment of net neutrality. And so more or less from an objective viewpoint. And we can ask questions, and tomorrow, please God, we should have a panel type discussion where we could delve a little more deeply into implications for the Caribbean and maybe some positions, some issues related to Caribbean positions. So we start this afternoon with net neutrality, and the speaker is Rob Frieden, and he holds the Pioneers Chair and serves as Professor of Telecommunications and Law at Pennsylvania State University. For the football fans or sports fans among us, they basically talk about Penn State. And he has authored over 100 articles and 4 books and has held senior level policy-making positions at the US FCC and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA. He basically represents the US government at the ICANN forum, at the ICANN GAC. Department of Commerce, I think they call it. Yes. Additionally, he's worked in the private sector as an attorney, including affiliation with startup ventures in fiber optic and low Earth orbiting satellite markets. Professor Frieden has a BA in telecoms policy from the University of Pennsylvania and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Virginia. So he'll come to talk to us about net neutrality. So let's welcome him to the podium.
Nigel, and thanks very much for your attendance. I guess they don't have siestas in Belize, otherwise known as British Honduras. I'm of an age where I actually knew the country by its former name. Not many countries I've visited that have changed names, so that's a treat. I've titled the presentation A Fair, Balanced, and Nuanced Assessment of Network Neutrality because, quite frankly, so many of the assessments that you're going to see or read or hear are not fair and balanced. They're one-sided and they're not nuanced whatsoever. I have the luxury, if you will, as a professor, to opt for unsponsored status in this network neutrality sweepstakes. If I had been sponsored, my family would be here and we'd be snorkeling on some beautiful key after the conference, but that won't be happening. So as a result of that lack of sponsorship, I'm here to give you my best assessment of the situation. It's very nuanced, it's very onion layered, and quite frankly it's very difficult, so it's easy to sort of simplify and lose the nuance, particularly because stakeholders have carved out particular positions, and in places like the United States this is so contentious, the stakes are so high that there seemingly is no middle ground. Either you're for it or you're against it. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of middle ground that often isn't assessed. This is not the kind of subject that can be sort of glossed over, no pun intended, with a glossy brochure from a particular stakeholder who will remain nameless. But maybe you know what I'm talking about. Those kind of glossy brochures are widely distributed by a variety of stakeholders, and they don't really get to the nuance. In the last couple of days, and certainly thinking about our situation here, I've sort of reached a conclusion that there really is a middle ground, and you can, without becoming Hydra-like, say, well, on one hand this, on the other hand that. A couple of days ago, I was asked to provide a technology policy primer for a United States senator, and for some reason the staff didn't want to use Skype. They didn't sort of go to Internet 2. They didn't secure a dedicated link. They used an alternative conferencing facility, and I had spent hours preparing a very user-friendly slide pack, and I rehearsed, because you don't often get to be a tutor of the United States senator. Make a long story short, there were so many dropouts, so many instances where the Internet's best efforts routing wasn't good enough. And you scratch a lot of consumers, and you sort of poll a lot of consumers and ask them, what do you think about network neutrality? And most of them, probably from a particular HBO commentator, think that network neutrality is fundamental. But when it comes to what I call mission critical bits, must-see TV, including the Olympics, including teleconferences with senators, including our teleconference to Barbados and elsewhere, you want better than best efforts routing. And that is something that we can explore. Where do you draw the line between discrimination, price discrimination, quality of service discrimination, quality of experience discrimination, which is okay by consumers, okay in the marketplace, versus when is this discrimination anti-competitive, harmful to consumers? That's really the kind of nuance and the deeper dive that I hope we can aspire to. Lastly, because there certainly are tourists who come to the Caribbean, a little louder, a little closer. Lastly, because there are a lot of tourists and people who come to Central America, South America, the Caribbean on holiday, think of the consumer expectations in terms of Internet access and Internet functionality that has occurred in record time, Internet time. Once upon a time, you came to these lovely resorts and you experienced them personally. You took photographs, maybe you had a slideshow after you got home, or you looked at the photographs, and you lived in the experience. Well, now, those cruise ship folks who come to visit, those people coming to the resorts expect to have Wi-Fi functionality, high-speed broadband internet. It's not even a question of just taking photographs of the manatee, taking photographs of the birds, or taking photographs even of the meal. It's doing that and then uploading it immediately. I think it sort of breaks the flow of the meal, quite frankly, and there's a pejorative phrase you may not have heard of so far called food porn. Food porn, interesting juxtaposition of words, but you know, you got to upload it immediately. It would be curtains for the free world if that beer that you tasted, Belkin, very nice, like the stout, wasn't uploaded to your list of beer consumption numbers. I have a friend of mine who goes to this website, and he's going to order the flight of beers and immediately upload the new labels, the new titles, to increase his number. So we're a very competitive species. So folks want to upload as they are experiencing the manatee, the birds. So how did we get here? How did we get here? I start by identifying quickly 4 phases of internet development. I'm glad to say I was pretty much experiencing just about all of them, including the bulletin boards. But we moved very quickly, internet time, if you will, from government incubation, government as an anchor tenant, government as an underwriter of the internet, government, in a sense, foreclosing the need to meter traffic or to look at cost causation because the taxpayer is paying, into an environment where the internet is privatized and commercialized and diversifying. And in that migration from government stewardship and academic funding to one of commercial context, cost causation really matters. Who is forcing the carrier, the internet service provider, to expand capacity to have to accommodate ever-growing demand for service, particularly downloading full motion video. So we've moved now, or are moving into a fifth generation, the developing fifth phase, if you will. And that's widespread diffusion of broadband, largely for two killer applications, Internet Protocol Television, IPTV. Sometimes I wish I got paid by the acronym, and I will just remind me if I don't to spell out every acronym. IPTV, Internet Protocol Television, and VoIP, Voice over the Internet Protocol. These are applications that are really driving subscribership, and particularly when it comes to full motion video, driving demand. There's a new market niche that's developing in this phase called Content Distribution Networks, CDNs. Historically, ISPs have basically interconnected and divided revenues based on traffic parameters. You peer, you engage in barter, a zero transfer of funds if your traffic is roughly equivalent. How much traffic is handed off from carrier A to B is roughly symmetrical, roughly equivalent to what is returned from carrier B to A. And if you didn't have that parity, you were a transit customer, you paid for bandwidth, you paid for the ISP to carry your traffic. Well, CDNs, by definition, are involved largely in the downstream flow of traffic. And there's a very asymmetrical traffic consumption by most users of the internet. Asymmetrical meaning that there's a lot more downstream than upstream. You go to Netflix and request a file with a very quick, very narrow band request. But then you are streaming downstream 2 hours worth of full motion video. So the aggregate volume of traffic downstream is substantially greater than the upstream command requesting that file. And CDNs have carved out a market niche to provide the downstream flow for video. So things are changing, and network neutrality, which is a concept that continues to morph, certainly is making a migration into a number of different contexts, which we can briefly identify today and perhaps delve more deeply tomorrow. So, broadly speaking, what is network neutrality? Well, network neutrality really, from my perspective, harkens back to an age where things were kinder and gentler and more comprehensible, more understandable. And a good example of that kinder, gentler, simpler environment is how many of us, perhaps less and less so as the generations evolved, first encountered the internet. Okay, I'm going to do a simulation of the internet modem handshake. Anybody remember dial-up? Right? Well, who provided the not so broadband, narrowband dial-up link? It was a telephone company. And that telephone company, from almost day one until the present with things changing, was regulated, treated as a public utility, as a common carrier. It wasn't a question necessarily of market power, but in a lot of markets there was only one carrier. It was more a question of functionality. Common carriers, by definition, are neutral conduits. The electric company is a neutral conduit. It delivers electrons, and those electrons can be used for any type of application, any type of usage, but they are in the electron distribution business. And just to show you how things are a little bit bizarre in the network neutrality world, the electron distribution company, the public utility, doesn't in effect change its prices as a function of what those electrons are used for. Video electrons are more valuable than audio electrons. International call electrons are more expensive than domestic electrons. No, the common carrier neutral conduit just as in the distribution of electrons, in the distribution of traffic. The content rides on that electron stream, but is fully, fundamentally separate. Okay? That was easy. That was easy. That was pre-convergence. Convergence, by definition, whether you look at it from a marketplace context or a technological context, converges, blends together content and conduit. Content and conduit, which means that the carrier no longer has no incentives to discriminate, no incentives to maybe favor a corporate affiliate, no incentives to maybe tilt the competitive playing field in favor of an affiliate or someone who pays a surcharge or an extra fee. A common carrier has no incentive to favor one consumer over the other, or at least there are legal regimes built in to force neutrality. Network neutrality is a goal of imposing, mandating that same neutrality, that same non-discrimination on ventures that, depending on your perspective, shouldn't be treated as neutral conduits, or who in effect have incentives not to be neutral conduits. So I have to express my ambivalence and the nuanced nature of the presentation by saying I am on board with the general concept of mandated neutrality. You can't necessarily eliminate the incentives. Okay, I don't like that word incentivize, which is taking a noun and making it a verb. It's not really a word, incentivize, but I'm certainly not in the camp that fails to appreciate that the carrier, the internet service provider, the wireless carrier, the cable company, whoever is providing that broadband link now has mixed motivations, mixed incentives. As a result, I believe there is a need for safeguards to prevent them from discriminating in ways that harms competition and harms consumers. That said, going back to IPTV, going back to the consumer, Wi-Fi consumer, the cruise ship consumer, the resort consumer who wants to upload the pictures of the beer or the wonderful fish meal or whatnot in real time using their smartphone, I believe that there are plenty of instances where better than best efforts routing, which is sort of different from the mainline traditional concept of best efforts routing, actually should be permitted and isn't something that is a violation of fundamental fairness or fundamental network neutrality. How do you square those two? How do you square those two? Because generally speaking, most presenters are going to say one thing or the other. They're going to be purists, they're going to be dogmatic, they're going to be pro, or they're going to be con, and I'm going to say, well, it depends. It depends. So bear with me. I hope I'm not this double-handed, multi-hydra-like presenter who does nothing more than confuse you. So if you are confused, stop me straight away, and I'll try to make sense of the situation. By way of sort of going in models of oversight, going in models of regulation, here they are. Laissez-faire, always classes up the joint with a little bit of French or Latin. Laissez-faire, let it be. Libertarianism, cyber-libertarianism, hands off. Government doesn't have much role, if any, in the marketplace for broadband and for broadband-mediated services. If it isn't broken, don't fix it, and the marketplace is wonderful, thank you very much. Well, some people believe that. And certainly network neutrality is, in some ways, market countervailing. Market countervailing. It remedies market failure. It remedies operations that are anti-competitive. Now, there are two ways to remedy problems if you're not a cyber libertarian. One is called ex ante, that's Latin, and the other one's ex post. Ex ante means you're going to look at the potential for violations that are harmful to consumers and competition, anticipate that they're going to occur, and try to prevent them from occurring prospectively. And that's what the Federal Communications Commission has done in the United States and a lot of other countries, including Brazil and Chile,
the Netherlands, most of the European Union have done. Ex ante, from before, anticipating problems and creating a structure, as awkward as that may be, to try to resolve it prospectively. The opposite is ex post. You get sued. There's a remedy after the fact, and maybe that remedy is delayed. Maybe it's just a financial reward, but the harm to the marketplace and to consumers has already occurred. So we have all kinds of regulatory models. PreConvergence that looks at different media, looks at different technologies in kind of silo-based system, a print system, a broadcast model, cable model, as well as the telephone or common carrier model. Those are the sort of baseline models with which to work. I would say network neutrality, particularly looking at what the FCC has done, is ex ante, largely common carrier, largely public utility based. Okay, if I haven't totally confused you, let's sort of step back and kind of deconstruct the internet and that lovely new concept called internet ecosystem. I wish I had $1 for every time somebody at some presentation of late has used the word ecosystem. Well, I think they're saying in effect that it's a market-driven or business now as opposed to taxpayer or government underwritten industry. In this ecosystem, there are different players. We've had a presentation that sort of took the OSI Open Systems interface 7 layers and sort of subdivided into 3 with a telecom layer, a protocol, TCP/IP layer, and then an application or content layer. There are 7, but three work as well. Another way to sort of structure our assessment of the ecosystem is to say, well, who interacts with the consumer? Who interacts with the end user? It's what I call the retail, the first and last mile, the first and last kilometer ISP. So the retail ISP is providing the last link to consumers, or the first link from consumers upstream and downstream. Now that ISP, maybe I should go to the next slide. That ISP, which is connecting those yellow squares, which are computers, or for that matter, smartphones, connects upstream. Upstream from the last kilometer ISP or other ISPs, or they could be content distribution networks. In this slide, level 3 is in the upstream position as an ISP, but also as a CDN. Level 3 is one of Netflix's outsourcing CDNs for managing a large portion of the Netflix traffic, and that's largely, again, downstream. And then upstream from level 3 could be other ISPs. Certainly, if you did a trace route analysis of how packets are routed from point A to point Z, you would see maybe dozens of different ISPs participating in the routing. I teach an Internet Technology for Non-Engineers course at Penn State, and we do a trace route. How are we going to get to Antigua? How are we going to get to Belize? How are we going to get to Australia? Well, it depends, because of best efforts routing as a function of what's available in terms of switching and routing capacity at that particular time. So there are lots of different players, but for our purposes, a content source, a content distributor, content packager, Hulu, what have you, a CDN or upstream ISP, and then a last kilometer ISP. These are different companies with different incentives. There are many, many ways to sort of frame the network neutrality debate. I'm not quoting here, but you could sort of summarize it into this dichotomy. Different stakeholders offering conflicting frames or perspective, a maturing, commercialized, fifth-generation internet ecosystem operating with what economists call a double-sided market necessitates unregulated flexibility to create new pricing, interconnection, compensation, options to achieve end-to-end connectivity. That's a mouthful. We can deconstruct that, which is what professors and academics do, but basically it's the marketplace operating. We're sort of addressing a maturing, diversifying internet with CDNs and different traffic, asymmetrical traffic flows. Juxtapose that with the last paragraph there on the slide. Last mile, last kilometer ISPs operate as terminating monopolies. That's an old public utility model that typically triggers common carriage and rate regulation with the incentive and the ability, not only the incentive to try to gouge or to discriminate, but the ability to do so in ways that harms competition and hurt innovation and hurt consumers, triggering the need for muscular ex-ante government regulation. That's about as broad a dichotomy as I could sort of weave in sort of identifying the scope of the stakes. So I've already talked a little bit about ex-ante and ex-post remedies. That's another frame or perspective for looking at network neutrality. If you are pro-network neutrality and if you are worried about the likely incentive and the ability to act on that incentive to discriminate in harmful ways, you're a candidate or a likely advocate for ex-ante regulation. If you think that you really can't trust government or regulators to anticipate every way the market is going to evolve, and if you think that maybe the market can solve a lot of things or there really isn't a problem to worry about, then you're more likely to say, well, let's await a competition authority or a court of law to resolve conflicts, disputes, disagreements, and litigation if and when those disputes arise. The U.S. approach, largely now ex-ante. The Federal Communications Commission tried 3 times to get it right. I guess third time is the charm, if you will. The FCC's ex-ante common carrier regulatory regime was upheld by an appellate court, and it may be appealed to the Supreme Court in the United States, but chances are that at least in terms of the lawfulness of and the jurisdiction of the Federal Communications Commission to impose these ex-ante rules, that issue has been resolved. So what's driving this? What's driving network neutrality disputes? If I had to distill it in terms of a sound bite, I would say ka-ching. And if you don't understand ka-ching as a cash register, I was saying it's all about money. It's all about money. Money is the root of all evil, perhaps, but looking at it sympathetically to the Digicels and the phone companies, wired phone companies and the cable companies, and they deserve some recognition of the expense they've incurred. They build a network, they upgrade that network, they upgrade that network again and again and again. One person's broadband is another person's narrowband. We just look at the evolution of the definition of broadband. Once upon a time, I guess it was 512 kilobits per second. That won't get you very far in terms of consumers' expectations. It's more like, well, how about multiple video streams at the same time? Multiple simultaneous full motion video streams at the same time. And that's roughly going to take you 3-4 megabits per second or higher on a good day. So what's driving the network neutrality debate is money, but also who pays for the upgrade? Who pays for the upgrade, in particular to provide a high reliability, high quality of service, high quality of expectation experience, customer experience, bit stream for full motion video. So you've heard the phrase, the acronym IPTV. The other acronym is OTT, over the top. So in addition to subscribers' broadband subscriptions for email, for what have you, now consumers are having an expectation that the network at no additional charge to the consumer, to the end user, can accommodate robust, full motion, simultaneous video streams. So I don't want you to think that I'm, in any one camp or the other, because here's a situation where I am sympathetic to the carriers who have incurred substantial infrastructure upgrade costs, no longer underwritten by government, no longer underwritten by the taxpayer, but basically underwritten by shareholders and banks who expect compensation as a result. So IPTV is the killer application that's driving a lot of the demand. There have been estimates by Sandvine and Cisco and others that say that in prime time, which is roughly 10 p.m. local, I'm already dozing and drooling, so I'm not part of the prime time experience, but my students are. At prime time, Netflix represents as much as 35% of total aggregate demand for the internet. Now, who pays? Who pays? Network neutrality advocates don't really spend a whole lot of time answering that question, except to say that Netflix, for example, shouldn't be singled out for kind of a shakedown, some extortion racket, some surcharge, just because they represent 35% of the aggregate demand. Now, The Economist, I'm not an economist, but The Economist says, well, we have to pay attention, and the regulator says we have to pay attention to who pays. Economists look at where the ISP lies in the infrastructure and says, well, they are operating what's known as a double-sided market. Double-sided market. They can recoup their investment in infrastructure downstream from consumers, end users, and also upstream from CDNs and maybe even from Netflix. So who are they going to recover their funds, their investment, infrastructure investment from? Perhaps an analogy might work in this instance. Credit card companies also operate in this double-sided market. Now, some of us have credit cards where there's no fee attached. In fact, some credit card companies actually pay you to use their credit card. Is this a great environment or what? Isn't the marketplace wonderful? I get to use the credit card and I get money back, right? Cash back, cash back. There are other credit cards made out of tungsten or titanium or super platinum colors or whatnot, still plastic, where you have to pay an annual fee. But largely the credit card companies recover the cost of basically handling a payment system, fintech, right, and forwarding funds, short-term loans, by swipe fees. The majority of the payment to in a double-sided credit card market is the upstream vendor. The restaurant, the hotel has to pay every time the chip card is inserted in red or the magnetic strip is red. But to be clear, it could be the other way around, and quite frankly, credit card companies have their cake and eat it too. They loan money to end users at very impressive rates, 18% or more, and they also have swipe fees at very impressive rates. In fact, I don't understand this. Maybe somebody can explain to me why a debit card, which is immediate transfer, generates higher swipe fees than a credit card. I think it has to do with the ability to, on the back end, charge that 18%, so maybe I did answer it. So at any rate, the question is really, how do you recoup the money? Well, you recoup the money by leveraging cooperation for a price. And that is something that is sort of anathema to the purist, the pure network neutrality advocate. Once upon a time, back there in the first generation, this was all kind of an experiment, kind of a socialistic experiment. Sua casa, mia casa, right? You take my network, I'll take your network, you take my switching and routing functionality, and I'll use your switching and routing functionality. We don't need to meter. In fact, metering's expensive.